Okay, so hello everybody, and this is to welcome you to an op-ed talk from the Summer Institutes at the University of Washington for 2020. I'm Bruce Weir in the Department of Biostatistics at UW, and it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Rori Rohlfs. Rori is in biology at San Francisco State University, and her interests are broad: population genetics, evolutionary genetics, statistical and forensic genetics. But she's also had a great deal of concern about equity and diversity issues. So she's going to give us her thoughts today. So Rori, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Bruce, and for the opportunity to talk today at the Summer Institutes. Back when I was a graduate student in genome sciences, the Summer Institute in Statistical Genetics was a really formative experience for me, so it's an honor to be here today. Okay, so I am indeed thrilled to have the faculty position in biology at SF State, and I do usually study statistical methods in forensic genetics, as well as the role of gene expression in evolution adaptation. But today I'm going to talk with you about some of my other work that's examining science history and social impact. Okay, so first let me set a scene for you. In 2009, I was a fourth-year grad student studying human statistical genetics. I was trying to understand linkage to disequilibrium and how we came to calculate it the way that we do. I was tracing back chains of references and found myself asking a librarian for a journal called The Annals of Eugenics. Now, what I knew at that time from my academic life were that there were some murky past entanglements between scientific racism and my field. As a young dyke who was disconnected from my queer elders, I was keenly aware that science had earned distrust in some parts of my community. Yet, the details were blurry to me. And as a middle-class white person, my privileges obscured the connections between science and eugenics, connections that were obvious to my Black and Indigenous peers. Yet that day in the library, as I held the journal, some of those murky connections became a lot more tangible. The same scientists who were widely revealed as the founders of my field had published heinous articles and supported racialized eugenic policies. I was seeing the racist and eugenic roots of my field. I felt repulsed, confused, and ashamed, and I quickly photocopied the article and returned the journal. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the ideas that I've picked up as a scientist working through this history, doing my science, and trying to figure out how to move forward. I do this not as an authority on science history or social justice or anti-racism, but as a fellow scientist. Okay, for folks who are as new to this history as I had been, eugenics is rooted in the idea that a person's genes determine their traits. Eugenics was really interested in traits like height, disability, intelligence, sexuality, criminality. Eugenics goes on to suppose that some trait variants are more valuable than others. Now, this idea is inseparable from scientific racism. The idea that human trait diversity can be categorized into biologically distinct groups or races which follow an inherent hierarchical structure. This type of genetic determinism has been used to justify slavery, colonization, and other manifestations of racism and ableism for centuries. With that deterministic theoretical underpinning, eugenics seeks to improve the human species through methods like forced sterilization, immigration restrictions, and other racialized social policies. It's important to note that eugenics had wide support across the political spectrum, specifically from many progressives of the day. Then, as now, academia was a major site of knowledge production, and academic ideas fueled the eugenics movement. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of these scientific connections. Let's go back to the Annals of Eugenics. It was established in 1925 by Carl Pearson, who was not some marginal person. Pearson was central to the field. He's credited with creating the chi-squared test, p-values, and PCA. He created the Annals of Eugenics to make a venue for, quote, the scientific treatment of racial problems in man. In 1934, the editorship of the Annals of Eugenics passed on to none other than R.A. Fisher, who was one of the founders of population genetics. Now, I'm going to ask you all a question. We'll see how many people are there and responding. I'm going to ask you to guess what happened to the Annals of Eugenics. So Sandra, if you can put up the poll now, and that would be just right. Okay, great. So hopefully you see this poll. So you can make a guess here. What do you think happened to the Annals of Eugenics? Do you think that A, academic protests led to the journal being dissolved? B, declining readership led the journal to fold? C, it changed names and continued to be published? Or D, it continues to be published today just as it was in 1934? So I'll give you just a few seconds to answer that poll. Okay, 3 more seconds, and then Sandra, can you show us the results of the poll? Great. So what are your guesses here? Okay, so I don't know if y'all are particularly savvy or you read an article, but the most popular response is that it changed names and continues to be published. We have some other folks who thought that declining readership might have led the journal to fold. Okay, so in fact, you all are right that in 1954, well after the end of World War II, the journal changed its names to the Annals of Human Genetics, which continues to be published today. So that shift of language wasn't unique to the journal. I worked with then undergrads Jasmine Cower and Richard Tam at my home institution, SF State, to examine our historical course offerings. We found that eugenics was taught in the biology department starting at the latest in 1926, with a course description, the study of the facts and problems of human heredity and the possibility of race betterment. I would hazard to guess that eugenics classes like this were ubiquitous across universities in the United States. So at SF State, the eugenics course was offered for the last time in 1951. However, in 1952, we see a new course appear in the catalog called Human Genetics. It's described as the principle of inheritance as applied to man, the role of heredity and environment, population genetics. So you can compare these course descriptions and you can see some clear parallels. There's a consistent interest in human heredity, and there's movement away from the language of blatant scientific racism towards population genetics and environmental factors. Okay, so, should we care? So I've shown you that we can follow the threads of eugenics history through to human and population genetics. And our next question is, should we be concerned? That was a long time ago, and the language shift does reflect more interest in population variation and environmental factors. So you might think that we had a clean break from our past in eugenics. And so then at this point now, we wouldn't need to be distracted by questions about how our work impacts social and racial justice. I do think it matters, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why. Okay. So number one, we must take accountability of how historical science caused past and continuing harm. The past actions of our field to create and support eugenics caused real harm, and we as a field should take accountability for that harm. Okay, so what is this vague harm I'm talking about? Let's take a moment for a thought exercise about the impact of, for example, the SFSU eugenics course. For a quarter of a century, students in that class were taught about the possibility of race betterment. Most of those students came on to become teachers themselves, and they disseminated the eugenic and racist ideas onto their students, where they likely spread through the community. I don't know how many people, thousands I'm guessing, were influenced by the ideas in this course. For the white students in particular, I want to ask, how did the scientific reasoning that was presented in the class, however flawed it was, bolster their racism and implicit bias over generations? How do those ingrained racist ideas influence a white police officer who is seeing a Black man? Or a white city planner who's deciding whether to zone for toxic industry in a Latinx neighborhood? Or a white scientist who is designing curriculum for genetics class today? In a reparations framework, our scientific community would owe a debt for those harms. Reason 2, we must avoid perpetuating harmful patterns in our current research, education, and scientific culture. Because genetic determinism is an implicit and stealth component of our academic inheritance, even well-intentioned scientists, like myself too, working at respected institutions, can unwittingly pursue activities that support eugenic arguments. I'll go so far as to provide a few examples. First, let's think about research. So today we are seeing numerous well-funded studies seeking to determine the genetic basis of traits which have social importance and clear, well-studied environmental influences. Traits like intelligence, sexual behavior, and income. Many scientists in our field have made technical critiques that call to question the validity of the scientific inferences in these studies. One such article noted that while the benefits are far from obvious, the risks of the results being misinterpreted and misused are quite clear. Yet, the persistence of these lines of inquiry belies a familiar and unchecked preoccupation with inborn differences for traits of social consequence. Here's another example, back to education. One of the courses I teach is genetics and is very close to my heart. As far as I'm aware, in a standard genetic class, there continues to be a strong emphasis on the inheritance of Mendelian traits that are entirely controlled by one or maybe two loci. We have maintained a curricular focus on genetically determined traits, despite the fact that it is now clear that the vast majority of traits are the result of complex interactions between multiple genetic loci and the environment. If we are not vigilant about reworking classical genetics curriculum, then we may convey an underlying impression of genetic determinism, which is a basic tenet of eugenics. And some final thoughts about our academic culture. First, I want to invite you to picture scientists of our field 150, just even 20 years ago. The image that you're creating is probably predominantly straight, white, non-disabled, cisgendered men, albeit from across the political spectrum, who are usually supported by their wives. Of course, this is not to say that those were the only people who were doing science, but that others were systematically marginalized. The institutional structures and cultures of academic science were designed for scientists from that homogeneous normative background, as is consistent with the values of eugenics and scientific racism. As a scientific community today, we have excluded and discouraged disabled, Black, Indigenous, Latinx scientists, women scientists, transgender scientists, and more. These biases in science have long been well documented in studies of student participation, postdoc and faculty hiring, grant funding rates, and more. This exclusion is to the detriment of science, since studies show that scientists from underrepresented groups and diverse teams produce more innovative research. Now, in this moment, in the midst of ongoing atrocities of racial injustice, academia has focused some attention on our own problematic treatment of scholars from historically underrepresented groups. It must be said that this attention is largely thanks to the work of Black scientists and academics writing articles, running trainings, organizing actions, and voicing their experiences. Now, I would argue that if we had indeed had a totally clean break from our roots in eugenics and scientific racism, then we would not be seeing these familiar patterns across our research, teaching, and scientific culture. Therefore, we have some reckoning to do. It's not enough for us to continue our work without being racist. To square up with our past and to get a future of science that is socially just, we must be actively anti-racist. And this means making fundamental changes in our research, education, and culture. Before we can make those meaningful and sustainable changes, we must become sincerely aware about the injustices in our field. This is especially important for those of us with privilege. We need to reckon with the injustice. Reckoning is a personal process that works best when we each sincerely engage with it. Today, I've shown you one way to go about reckoning that works for me, which is following historical threads into the present. Your approach might be quite different. You might have already identified injustices by reflecting on your own personal experience. Or you might have an eye-opening moment when you're reading the experience of a colleague from a historically underrepresented group. Whatever your process is, getting clear on the problems is necessary to making change. Now, many of you here at the Summer Institutes are graduate students. As grad students, you've been indoctrinated into science for less long than myself or most of your mentors. So as you navigate academic science, you might bump up against norms that your mentors and I are so accustomed to that we're not even aware of them. This means that you are very powerfully positioned to identify and question those norms. You all are the future of science, and as you engage in your own reckoning process, you are laying the foundation for what is to come. To invoke the late, great John Lewis, you have the opportunity to get on the right side of history. After you do your reckoning work, then I hope that you will feel motivated to take action to make some changes, to move towards social justice in science. To do so, you've got to be connected and empowered. A key element is to cultivate community. I'll paraphrase the insight of one of the brilliant students in my lab, Nico Seperio, who made a call to build community to enable students to collectively support one another in order to persist in their work and to collaborate on actions. These connections can be sustaining, empowering, and joyful. I know I would not be here today without my own meaningful relationships in academia. With that community, we've got to take care of ourselves and each other. For some folks, especially those who are targeted because of one or more of their identities, just being here in science and being true to themselves is already enough. Those scientists should not be overly burdened with a need to address every problematic event or dynamic that they encounter. Especially for those of us with privileged identities and positions, we have got to be attentive to the voices of scholars from targeted groups without relying on them to educate us specifically. We are extremely fortunate that in this particular moment, there is an abundance of specific calls to action from Black scholars in particular. And here are a couple of examples. In Dr. Jasmine Roberts' Medium article, White Academia Do Better, she lists a number of specific actions for white academics, including to diversify curriculum to improve inclusivity, to promote Black scholars to leadership positions without tokenizing them, and to hire, collaborate with, and cite Black scholars. For another example, Brandon Agbunu published an article in Scientific American titled, "For Scientific Institution, Racial Reconciliation Requires Reparations." In it, Dr. Agbunu proposes to devalue measures of accomplishment that are shown to have racial bias, possibly including H-values or student evaluations. His counterpoint is to value activities where Black scholars are leaders, possibly including community engagement or scientific communication. Together with this community support, care for each other, and context by listening to the voices of scholars from historically underrepresented groups, we've got to now take action to make change. Okay, so what does that action look like? I think the answer depends quite a lot on your positioning. Well, scientists at all career positions, particularly those of us who are more advanced, have a role to play. Today, I'll share a couple of ideas that might be relevant for graduate students. As graduate students in science, you can take hold of the power that you have in order to make changes where you have traction. I think a common path to start is by naming what you see happening. We're all scientists here and we love some observations and data. So it's a natural next step to make observations and report on them. Other names for this activity might be speaking up, calling out, or sometimes speaking truth to power. So for example, say you observe a troubling trend in your departmental dynamics. You might first talk with your safe, close community. Your group might work together to bring the issue to people in power in your department, prompting a shift. Or you and your crew might launch your own campaign to create that shift. Or you might just get validation from your community and decide that it is not strategic to work for that shift at that time. Whatever the case, by speaking up, you open possibilities. Grad students often have power in the course sections they teach. You could use that to improve inclusive teaching practices, answering Dr. Jasmine Roberts' call. You could answer another one of her calls in your own research by reading and citing the innovative work by scholars from underrepresented groups. If you are open to it, this habit may shift and improve your own research.
1 minute, Rory.
1 minute? Okay, great. So I'll say, these are just some ideas. I don't know what making change is going to look like for you. You are the ones who will figure that out, and you are the ones with the perspective for innovation. By doing the sincere work in your communities, you're the ones who are going to bring us closer to social justice and science. So later on today, after this talk and after your afternoon of mixed models, genetic epidemiology, or statistical genetics, I'm going to invite you to sit with this question. Just how will you move forward towards social justice and science? In answering that question and doing the work, we will get closer to an anti-racist future in science, where the social impact of our basic and translational research is embedded in project development and design, where culturally relevant genetics classes welcome students to expand on their lived experience and follow their scientific curiosity as they gain technical knowledge and skills, where disabled, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx scientists thrive as students and faculty in our science departments, and where the influx of scientists from diverse social backgrounds results in a dramatic increase in scientific innovation, answering questions that were previously considered unresolvable, and sparking a radiation of novel scientific subfields. That is where we must arrive. Okay. I have many things to give, but I'll just thank Bruce for the invitation, Sandra for setting all of this up, my insightful colleagues, Amelia Huerta-Sanchez, Brandon Agbunu, and Doc Edge for conversations that helped me develop these ideas, and of course, the brilliant students who I work with at SF State, from whom I learned so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. It's given us food for thought and carefully reasoned as always, so we appreciate it. So we're going to stop in a minute, I think, Sandra. So this has been recorded, and I think I'm guessing it will be quite widely shared and used. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Bruce.
Say goodbye to everybody. Take care.